working on for a while now. We actually just released the second edition of the book, and it's called Ethical Leadership: A Primer. And this is the book. And what it does is two things. First of all, and it's basically what we're going to be giving you a taste of today in the webinar. It examines ethical models and their implications for leadership, but also examines leadership models and their implications for ethics. So we're going to be giving you just a taste of the book today. The way the book is set out is we explain a particular model, and then we use a case study to really show this abstract concept on the ground. So I'll give you about 5 ethical models that we look at in the book. And then Stan will look at about 5 leadership models, and we'll use some of the case examples, but we won't go to in as much detail as we do in the book, of course. But I think that you'll get the feel for it. What we're hoping to accomplish today is, one, learn how to use the various approaches to ethics to make ethically sound decisions as a leader. I think that one of the things that education recently has failed to do is talk about ethics in a way that is practical for people. And yet there is nothing as practical as a good theory. So to be able to understand why you're making the choice you're making in a particular situation. And then we're going to look at the ethical implications of various approaches to leadership. So many of you might have understood, or at least heard of, concepts such as servant leadership or transformational leadership. Many of these leadership approaches have ethical implications. What we do in the book is really talk about those and why they are important for leaders. So the last thing that we're going to do today is just hopefully in our conversation at the end of our dialogue is to say, how can one's position of leadership, maybe the position that you're in, how can that help bring about positive change? So those are our 3 takeaways today. Learn various approaches to ethics, learn various approaches to leadership, their ethical implications, and how you can use this in the practical world. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing that I think we need to do as we're talking is give our definition of leadership. Now, usually if you have 3 people in the room, there's probably 3 different definitions of leadership there. So we start our conversation in the book and our conversation today with a definition that we'll use throughout our presentation here. I think a lot of people, when they think about leadership, they think about a person. So whether it be the president of a company or of a country, or even in a parent type situation, but they think of it as a person. And what we're going to challenge you today to do is think of it more as a process. And it's a reciprocal process with leaders and followers working towards a goal or goals within a context that's shaped by particular cultural values and norms. So once again, it's a process by which leaders and followers develop a relationship, work together towards a goal or goals within a context that's shaped by various cultural values and norms. Now, I want to graph that out for you here, and I'll give you an example just to consider this a little bit more. So leadership is something that we do on an everyday basis, right? So we could even say that today, Henry, Stan, and I are the leader of the webinar, right? And as participants in the webinar, you're followers. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm just going to drag you to the goal of understanding the information today. There's going to be this reciprocal process of you posting questions in the chat, of you perhaps disagreeing with something that we say in our discussions, right? That this is a mutual process. Our goal is to understand in today's conversation what ethical leadership is and how we can apply that. There is a context here. Our context happens to be technology. And to be very frank with you, I'm a little worried about that. I'm used to, people live in a room, sitting there in front of me. I can see their nonverbals. Are they getting it? Are they not? The context today is, we had people turn their cameras off and their mics off. That's not my usual context in the classroom, but it's a context that's affecting my leadership today and Stan's leadership. And we also have cultural values and norms. I would imagine that all of us are from a Western context. What does that mean? Well, it means that we value time. This better have something worth your time today. It better not just be Stan and me chatting. There is the Western norm of asking questions. When I have given presentations, I'll never forget when I've given presentations in Brazil, if someone asks a question, they're really challenging my authority. In a Western context, I don't think of it that way. When I lecture with my Japanese students, they will never ask a question because, God forbid, I may not know the answer, right? And I would lose face. So when I'm working with my Chinese students or my Japanese students, I actually give everyone in the class little index cards to ask questions because then I can go through it. And if I don't know the answer, I don't have to take that card. So it allows people to participate. My American students are never afraid to ask questions. And if they catch me up, they get a point, right? So I just use that to kind of bring this concept of leadership down the abstraction ladder to where I understand it with teaching, but it's even happening with the situation that we're in right now. So we're going to use this model and this definition as we look at ethical theories and leadership theories in order to understand them a little bit more. All right, so now that we understand the definition that we're using, let's look at the concept of ethical leadership, right? Because everyone's got a view of this too. And I think a lot of people think, well, I'm a good person. Of course I'm ethical, right? And you very well may be. But what we're going to define it as is understanding leaders using various approaches to ethics to make sound decisions. Why you're making a particular decision you're making and what ethical approach is that based in. And then also using one's position of leadership to bring about positive change. Power is a part of leadership. So how are we using our power to bring about positive change? So those are our definitions of ethical leadership that we're going to move forward. All right, now let's get into the meat of our conversation today. And we're going to start with using sample ethical models and considering their implications for leadership. So we're going to start with one that many people have heard of, and it's Kantianism. And I always tell my students, look, you can't be afraid of these terms. If you just consider them as a question and kind of frame it around a question, you'll understand what the ethical theory is getting at. So Kantianism was developed by Immanuel Kant, and it basically asks, what is the moral duty of leaders and followers, right? So you've heard probably the concept of the categorical imperative. Categorically, if it's right not to lie, you should never lie in any situation, full stop, right? There is a moral duty that one has. It's that idea of act upon the maxim that you would want to become the law. So if you don't want other people to lie to you, you should never lie to other people, right? Easy breezy. Now, what does that mean for leadership? Well, in this instance, what Kantian says is that the context never matters. You have a duty to the goal, right? So let's use a recent example to understand this. So a few years ago, Apple was really dinged for having different standards at their American factories and their outsourced factories in China, specifically Foxconn, right? American factories or American stores, they're following OSHA, they're very people-friendly, they've got wonderful benefits for people. Their factories in China, in specifically Foxconn, people were treated very badly. They were exposed to some horrible chemicals. They were working unrealistic hours, sometimes 18, 20 hours a day. They were living at the factory. So when you're thinking about that from a standpoint, Apple Computer was the leader. Their employees in that case were the followers. And the goal in that case was to manufacture electronics ethically. The context was Foxconn in China, and your cultural values and norms were the difference between the US culture of safety and the Chinese culture of safety. So really why they were perceived, and I would argue were unethical in the way they were working with Foxconn, is from a Kantian perspective, they were not manufacturing their products ethically, even though there were competing cultural values and norms there. So that kind of shows you how this is one approach to ethics with a very real, tangible, practical application there. What should one do? Well, if you're going to manufacture electronics, if you're going to do it ethically, you should do it ethically in the United States or in China, right? Okay, that's one example. Let's give you another. Now, the other end of the spectrum is utilitarianism, or sometimes called consequentialism, right? This is more of that idea of context matters a lot. So you ask the question, what is the greatest good for the greatest number of people? That's the basic question. Now, the question there begs is the question that's begged is, what's good? And who are you talking about in that greatest number, right? So there's problems with all of these theories, right? But here's an example of this. So what's the greatest good for the greatest number of people? In that context, absolutely matters. So I'm going to bring up a controversial issue, which is not surprising. And there's all kinds of controversies in our book here. We hope to be banned in at least 38 states. So let's talk about a very recent question about vaccines, right? All right. So during COVID, you had this whole conversation around vaccines. So in that case, you had leaders that were the public health officials. You had the followers who were the citizens. The goal was public health. Now, in most contexts, we don't mandate people to have particular medical treatments, right? We really value people's own autonomy in making their own medical decisions. In that context, however, you had many people saying, no, if you're going to be a part of this organization, you need to have a vaccine, right? Or you need to wear masks, right? That was all in the context of Western medicine. And it was also in the context of the United States, which has a very individualist culture. Now, you can see why, in that even though it was probably better for public health to do that, why the context and even our cultural values and norms were really competing with what people were willing to do within that context. But it was a utilitarian argument that was being said. For the public health, the greatest good for the greatest number of people is to have people vaccinated, right? So we've looked at Kantianism, utilitarianism, or consequentialism. Those are two. We're just going to go over a couple, not all that are in the book. Okay, virtue ethics. This is by Aristotle. Many people think about this. And in fact, when people say, hey, I'm a good person, of course I'm going to be ethical, right? So you have to dig a little deeper in that. What kinds of virtues would we consider ethical, right? Or that a good person should have?
I'll give you a cookie, but
I
not
think
that.
one would be honesty. It would be integrity, doing what you say you're going to do. There's many virtues that Aristotle talked about and that we could consider to talk about today. One, though, is just basic honesty. So let's look at that. Now, when you're thinking about the 5 components of leadership model in that context, you're really looking at the leader. What virtues does the leader have that is going to make that person act ethically? So this is a an example that we use in the new edition of the book that I think relates really well. I don't know if you're familiar with the Air Force cheating scandal that happened during COVID. But what happened was, COVID hit, it was over spring break. Many universities, including Muskingum, but also the Air Force Academy, they sent all of these students home in order to take their classes online. Again, it was a utilitarian argument, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Okay, but what happened during that? Well, a lot of the students cheated. Now, yes, all over Muskingum, Ohio State, I'm sure, but it was a really big deal at the Air Force Academy. Many cadets cheated, but there's also a code that every Air Force cadet signs that says essentially one of their virtues is they're going to be honest, right? So when this all broke, they obviously broke their virtue code. So there you have the cadets as the leaders, the fellow cadets at the followers. The goal was to follow the honor code, but it was in the context of online education and also a larger context of cheating culture, which is frankly part of the Western context right now, right? Is a lot of students, if you ask them, is it okay to cheat to get a good grade? They'll say, yes, the ends justify the means, right? But that is not what the honor code says. So there you see, here's a virtue approach to ethics where the leaders, the cadets, were not following that approach. And so the Air Force Academy is now rethinking their honor code and how to build virtues more into the soul of their cadets, right? All right, one or two more. Cultural relativism. This one always hangs people up because the question is, how do culture and context impact leadership? But they do, right? They absolutely do. So in that, we're really looking at the culture. So how do you come to a decision if one culture says something's right and another culture says it's wrong? Okay, here's another example. Again, it's going to be controversial. Years ago, GE introduced ultrasound technology into India. Well, with ultrasound technology, you can tell the sex of a child. In India, if you have a boy, that boy is going to have responsibilities for taking care of you in your old age. There's going to be an economic benefit to having a male child. Whereas if you have a female child, that child is going to go to another family. There's going to be a dowry. There is an economic cost for that, right? So when GE, the leader, introduced ultrasound technology to patients in India, what they found is the context, many people were using the ultrasound technology for sex-selective abortions. So the goal for GE was to distribute this ultrasound technology, but there were real Western and Eastern cultural clashes there. In the West, an abortion on the basis of a child's biological sex would be considered immoral. In India, an abortion based on a child's biological sex would be considered practical, right? So what GE did in that situation is they worked with the Indian government, one, to make sure that the ultrasound technology couldn't be used for sex-selective abortions, and they worked to get laws prohibiting that. And again, that was a huge cultural clash, and some people would take issue with that. But that was the ethical crux of that conversation. Okay, one more just for kicks and giggles. The common good. The common good asks, what is the common good demand of leadership? What's good for everybody, right? In this, the common good considers the culture, the context, the leaders, the followers, and the goal, right? So I've done a lot of work around this. This is one of my particular areas of ethics that I like. I'm going to call the common good the natural world. We all need water, clean water to drink. We need clean food to eat. We need clean air to breathe. It's the natural world. So think about this in the context of the Paris Accord Agreement, which basically asks countries to reduce their emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius by X date in order to mitigate global climate change. In that situation, the leader is the United Nations. The followers are these different countries. The goal is to reduce pollution and address climate change in our context of a constantly warming world. And our cultural values and norms, that's difficult, because you've got communitarian cultures who say, yes, we're going to do things for the common good, and individual cultures that say, what's good for me is good for me. There is no common good, right? The common good would say, do you need clean air? Do you need clean water? Do you need food to eat? Do you need land that is sustainable to live on? So the common good is something that, even though people may take a hit, it's still good for them, right? Okay, so those are 5 approaches to ethics and their leadership implications. Now, Stan is going to talk about 5 approaches to leadership and their ethical implications. Take it away, Stan.
Thanks, Rob. So what I'd like to do, I am very much a practitioner, and so I'm just going to put this in practitioner terms as we walk through this. Rob, as you're talking about the 5 component model, one of the things that occurred to me was, we might think of the leadership, which is all this together. The leadership question is really about issues of how, right? How are things happening? How are things getting done? How is positive change being made? We might think of the leader and the follower as the who, right? Who's involved in this process? The goal you might think of as the what. What is it that we're trying to achieve? The context, in a lot of ways, is the where, right? Whether it's a geographical context, to a certain extent, maybe a particular cultural, organizational context. And then as we get out to that largest sphere, the culture piece, we're getting into a lot of why questions, values-based questions, and some of the more philosophical type questions. That might be another way to look at this. I mention that because what I like about this model is I see it as really helping with 2 things. Number one, think of it as a lens. Okay, as we talk about these different leadership models and ethical models, the lens is about helping you see some things you may not have seen before, right? So when we put on the greater good set of lenses, we're able to see a different picture, maybe a more holistic picture than we did before. When we think about virtue, right, the lens that we put on helps us really drill down and think about the individual virtues of the leader involved. So with that, let's start moving into the models. As we get into the models, I also want you to think of these as toolkits, right? There's a great joke about, if you only have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, right? And although a hammer is great, if I'm trying to fix my smartwatch, it's probably not going to go well. So what are some other models that we can bring to bear in our leadership? Well, one of those is servant leadership, which is really asking about, okay, how can leaders really serve their followers and serve their organizations? The servant leader model, brought to us by a gentleman named Greenleaf, is really asking about motivation. And it begins with the desire to serve first, rather than a focus on the benefits of leadership, maybe the desire to control or the desire for status, things of that nature. So as we look at our 5 component model, if we put on the servant leadership lens, right, it's really helping us see the leader and think about the leader's relationship to their followers. And again, as I was kind of prepping for our conversation today, I really thought, and Rob, this might be something we could discuss in a future edition. In a sense, it's almost like the leader-follower circles have been flipped, because in that servant leader model, the leader is really about focusing on the needs of the follower and supporting the follower in the leadership context. So it's a different kind of relationship. with a different kind of motivation. If you're familiar with leadership studies, there's a famous study going all the way back to the 1950s that identified for managers this tension between tasks and relationships. And although the leader, a servant leader, is definitely focused on getting tasks done, there also is a genuine motive of concern and a genuine relationship for that leader with the followers. So to also think of this in terms of a toolkit, if you are a leader and you're trying to think about where to put your energy, right, and you're trying to be a servant leader, then part of that's going to be thinking through your relationship with your followers and your motivation for working with those folks. Okay, let's go to the next model. Yeah, transformational leadership. In a sense, transformational leadership, there's a lot of similarities with servant leadership because we're talking about how leaders can create positive change for their followers, but we're also, to use a phrase I heard the other day, embiggening. we're expanding our area of concern to think about change for themselves, change for the followers, and change for the organizations. One of the things that's great about transformational leadership, as far as a set of lenses, is it helps us remember that leadership is about creating change, right? And so transformational leadership is thinking in terms of positive change, an ethical kind of change. It's not just about making things happen, but the values behind why those things are happening. Taking people, if you will, to sort of a higher state of being. And that change impacts, or we're evaluating the change for the leader, how the leader is being changed. We're evaluating the follower. What is the impact on the follower? How are they being changed? And as well as the goal, what is that goal really about? Transactional leadership is essentially that sort of carrot and stick kind of leadership. I give you a gold bar, you do the task, right? And it's simply a transaction. Transformational leadership is looking at those relational dynamics and putting more of an ethical piece on that and an emphasis on good, transforming for the good. Okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah, followership. So followership may sound like an awkward topic in a leadership class, but remember, when we define leadership, we're defining it in a bigger sense where followers are part of leadership. And so the followership model is asking, how can followers partner with their leaders to do the right thing? So as we move on to that circle, notice here we're looking at the relationship between the follower and how they either support or challenge the leader. If we're not careful, when we think of ourselves as followers in organizations, we may just be implementers. We may just be people who get things done for the leader. And in doing that, we're not a partner. A person who's a partner relates to someone almost as a peer. And so what that means is, from an ethical perspective, good followers support good leadership, good leaders, good leadership. And good followers then also challenge bad leaders or bad leadership. This is especially important when we consider that Ira Chalif is the one who brings this model forward to us. I'd encourage you to follow some of his work. And he talks about part of what inspired him was he grew up in a community where he knew people who had tattoos on their arms. And as a child, he would ask his parents about these folks, and they would say, well, we don't talk about this. And later he discovered these were people who had survived the Holocaust. And he became interested in these questions of, gosh, how is it that individuals could carry out these horrific actions that were carried out during the Holocaust? And what is it that we can do to help folks stand up under pressure so that they can exert ethical influence? And so that's why it's so important to understand followers as partners and as moral actors who are responsible for their actions. So to simply say the leader made me do it doesn't get us off the hook ethically. Next is adaptive leadership. So you may have heard the term VUCA, right? This idea of volatility, uncertainty, complexity. We live in an environment where there are a lot of complex challenges. Adaptive leadership is great at working with those because it recognizes technical challenges are those that typically have a very simple, straightforward cause and effect solution. Adaptive challenges are for those more tricky situations and contexts. So that's why if we look at the model, the adaptive leadership model really focuses our lenses and our energy on working with the context. The first step for an adaptive leader is to get up on the balcony, if you will. It's hard to see the whole picture if you're inside the frame, right? So we get outside the frame, and we want to help our followers also be as connected as possible to that context. They're going to do a lot of the heavy lifting. They're going to be the ones who are really working with the problem rather than us being the hero that tries to come in and save everything. Next, toxic leadership. So this was an add-on to the book for a variety of reasons. One is it's interesting, in 2018, toxic became the word of the year for the Oxford English Dictionary. Oftentimes we talk about toxic situations. Certainly leaders or workplaces can be toxic. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot, sort of like burnout. And so the point of this chapter is to help us clearly see what toxic leadership really is so that we can understand it. And I think the best way to understand it is to think in terms of toxic leadership is what happens when we're all worse off from the experience. Toxic leaders are like those who fire poisoned arrows into their organizations. And in order to really understand that and to work with or challenge toxic leadership, we want to give our energy or give our attention to three things. We want to think about the context, we want to think about the individual leader, and we want to think about the followers. Remember earlier how we talked about that followers have a moral responsibility. They are culpable for their actions. And so part of what happens in toxic leadership is the followers become toxic. Often it's because the worst parts of them are being appealed to and being empowered by that leader. It can also be because you have a really negative leader who is sort of making followers as many versions of themselves. Obviously, the motivations of the leader came up earlier when we talked about things like servant leadership. Sometimes the toxic leader is toxic because of malice. Sometimes it's because of incompetence and that they're not able to meet the challenges of the leadership situation. And then that's what causes the organization to be worse off. But the other piece of this to be aware of is this idea of context. Certain contexts may promote toxicity, right? Especially situations where you don't have checks and balances, situations where there's a lot of turnover, possibly situations where there's a lot of complexity. So if we don't handle that context in a proper way with maybe more of an adaptive leadership model, and we don't admit the complexity, the leader may say, hey, only I can save you from this context and this problem. So that's an overview of these different leadership models. We did want to make sure we had some time for some discussion and some question and answer. So I'd like to actually kick this off by asking, which of these models relates to where you are currently? Which of these seems to be a tool that you can really relate to?
And I would also add to that, and I'm sure Henry would agree, please feel free to turn on your cameras or your microphones. And I think that Henry's also been monitoring the chat, so there might be a couple questions in there as well. Henry, did we have any specific questions in the chat just to get people going?
To get us started, the question I have is, what examples do you have with both of you guys' past experiences in ethical leadership in your various roles?
So I think it's an everyday thing. Stan and I were talking the other day, and I don't think that we realize how deep ethics goes, right? So for example, Stan was talking the other day about being at the airport, and some people got bumps because they overbooked, right? Well, there's an ethical argument for that. They overbook because a lot of people don't show up. And if a lot of people don't show up, they are going to be expending a lot of resources. That's going to hurt the company. That's going to hurt the environment more. But it does mean that some people get bumped from flights on occasion, right? So when they do that, they often offer someone an incentive, right? If they just bumped them without first offering an incentive and some compensation for that, I think that that would be unethical. On the other hand, from just a standpoint of the greatest good for the greatest number, yeah, they probably should overbook, right? Even though some people are inconvenienced by that. So what surprises me is that how quotidian, everyday ethics and leadership comes into our day-to-day lives that we just don't even think about, right? So it's not necessarily all the big decisions. It's also the little decisions that have ethical and leadership implications.
Unmute myself. There's leadership for you. Henry, I'd like to give you a personal example of this too. Can we go back to the toxic leadership slide? So several years ago, or let's see, that's the.
Sorry about that, gang.
No, that's fine. Oh yeah, that's right. That's Rob. It's taking care of that. Several years ago, I was brought in as a consultant to do an ethics review of a particular leader in an organization. And after interviewing all the followers in this setting, I found, and remember, we're talking about these lenses and tools, right? So I really found that the leader didn't seem to be the problem. And as we continued to have conversations, what we realized was that the leader actually had found themselves in a toxic context. And with conversation, we realized really for that leader's sake, they were going to have to exit the context. Because in that context, they were essentially going to be in a situation where they would always be more or less a scapegoat. They would not be trusted. They were simply not set up to succeed. And so here's an example of starting the attention with followers, finding out the information of the situation, then looking up to the leader, finding out what's going on with the leader, and then realizing, oh, wait, the problem in this toxic situation is not the followers, not the leaders, it's the context.
What other questions might be out there for everyone? And you're welcome to put it into the chat or just join in the conversation. We still have about 15, 16 minutes here, maybe a little more.
Oh, that is so true.
Yeah. Okay. So Patricia makes this great observation. Toxic leaders take up most everyone's time and are almost never recognize that they are in fact toxic. Yeah. Either because of incompetence that's not recognized, or again, because of a kind of malice that's self-justified. Recently, and Rob, you may have the Freneo podcast.
Right? I don't know if I heard that one.
Yeah, so ILA has a podcast called Freneo, and a couple episodes back, there was one on dealing with difficult people. And what I really appreciated about the episode was that the person being interviewed, and they had a law background, a legal background, but they now do consulting in organizations dealing with difficult personalities and conflict. The takeaway was that a lot of times these people don't realize what they're doing. And so one of the first steps is to help these people see what they're doing and their consequence to the organization. Now, doing that can be really tricky. Then we shift into kind of followership mode, possibly. But I would encourage you to take a look. There's a question about spelling. I'm going to go Google this real quick, and I'll put a link in if that's okay.
Yeah, and I think that I'll stop the share just so we can have more of a conversation and see folks if they'd like it. I also think, there are different kinds of bad leadership, right? And I think that this is really something that we're learning more from. Well, usually when you say you're studying leadership, people think that you're studying good leadership. And there's a lot that can be learned from that. There's also a lot that can be learned from studying bad leadership. Barbara Kellerman talks about two kinds of bad leadership: ineffective and unethical. Ineffective, they just can't get the job done for whatever reason, incompetence or what have you. Unethical, there is more malice. It can even go to maybe they're corrupt, maybe they're very rigid, or maybe they're evil. And we do see evil leadership where people are physically harmed, right? But again, and I am not letting bad leaders get off the hook here, but followers are part of the leadership process. And they are also there to put a check in place when bad leadership is happening, right? Now, in order for that to happen, there has to be some protections. And we've often seen followers really take a hit when they do whistleblow or bring to light things that are going poorly. But I kind of go back to what Stan was saying, is that we cannot place all the blame on leaders for bad leadership, because we as followers are also culpable in allowing that either unethical or ineffective behavior to continue. Yeah. Other thoughts? Oh, what did you find there, Stan?
Yeah, it's phronesis and not phroneo. And again, I'm a Greek geek in college. I took Greek, and so I accidentally used the first person verb form of phronesis. My bad.
How dare you?
Yeah, I know. Sorry. Yeah, to Rob's point about the followership piece, in my work as a coach, I really double down on that space. A lot of times I'm working with maybe a vice president or director, manager level folks. So although I do some work with C-level folks, and even those folks, there's some followership issues I help them with. A lot of the work is kind of in that next step down as they're promoting up. And I spend a lot of time helping them think about, what does it look like to partner with their leader? What are the skills needed to challenge that leader when they're off track? As well as, what are the skills that's going to help support that leader? And again, one of the biggest things, and we hinted at this earlier, is just helping the leader see their impact on the organization. And again, this goes back to when we talk about adaptive leadership, getting out of the frame so we can see the whole picture. There are ways you can have these conversations. And as a leader in any level in the organization, working with peers, working with maybe a person who's a supervisor, working with your board, working with those you supervise, to whatever extent you can help people get outside the frame, see the larger picture, and understand the impact of their work. That's really important for ethical leadership.
I would say also that, something that we didn't have a chance to talk about as much in the webinar are some of the ethical implications of some of these approaches to leadership. So, for example, with adaptive leadership, and the person behind adaptive leadership, his name is Ron Heifetz. And there's a really good book that he's written called Leadership on the Line, where he kind of puts out his idea of adaptive leadership. And it is very context-based. And it's this idea that followers are instrumental in identifying the goal and helping to solve the adaptive problem, right? Now, there are some ethical implications for that. And one is virtue of honesty. So as a leader, are you just this Machiavelli giving people the idea that they think that they're, doing this to solve the problem, or are you really empowering them to solve the problem, right? And also, what type of pressure are you putting on your your followers to solve the problem? Is it a sustainable pressure, or is it such a pressure that it is going to break them? There is a delicate balance in that. So even these leadership theories, they have ethical implications. Some people, servant leadership has really been kind of called into question lately, because even though it flips the idea of servant on its head, where the leader is the servant to the follower, there is a bit of patronizing with considering, as a leader, I am going to serve you, and this is what you need to do, right? So there are some ethical implications to even these approaches to leadership, just as there are leadership implications to the approaches to ethics. Yeah.
So we do have a question in the chat box in relation to, we've said that toxic leadership requires followers. Is there such a thing as ethical followership?
So Stan is the follower guy. He's done a lot of work around this area. Stan, I really think that you should take this one.
Yeah, so I'm going to say all followership is ethical followership.
Should be.
Yeah, well, it is, in the sense of there are values at play. And this is where, when these toxic situations, really, you got to start with a challenge stance to the extent that you can do so without ruining yourself. And if you get to the point where the challenge is not effective, then that's where you have to start thinking about leaving. That's also where these questions about being a whistleblower can come up. Thankfully, though, there are things that you can do that are much lower level, right? So, as you know, if you hear something from a leader that you feel is suspicious, you can just ask clarifying questions. Okay, what I understand you telling me to do is to sign this person up for these financial products, even though they didn't ask for them. Is that correct? Right? And so sometimes that clarifying question alone helps the leader kind of wake up and go, no, okay, yeah, can't do that. Sometimes it's about helping people see, again, the impact of what they're doing. Sometimes it means ethics hotlines, things of that nature, bringing in external resources to help you. In our current book, we talk about a sex abuse scandal in the Southern Baptist Convention and how the media played a role in really bringing issues to light. And in fact, both this edition and the last edition, for followers, the media played a very important role in helping make change happen and helping those followers challenge their situation. So yes, there is such a thing as ethical followership. Again, support the good leaders, support good leadership, challenge bad leaders, challenge bad leadership. And what that challenge looks like is going to vary depending on the severity of the situation.
If I may add to that just a little bit, Stan, toxic leadership also looks at toxic forms of followership. And one is colluders and conformers, right? So the colluders with a toxic leader, they're often getting something out of it. So they actively pursue this very negative goal. Conformers just don't say anything, or just don't really go up against the leader or the system. And so I do think that there are toxic forms of followership as well.
Yeah, I think followers, again, I think we can use that term follower as almost a pejorative sometimes, as if to be a follower is to simply be passive. And what we're doing in this conversation is helping challenge that notion and to realize that followership is a very active vocation, if you will, especially in terms of being a courageous follower.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to, maybe we should have talked about this. A leader, in the way we talk about it in the book, is it's anyone with more authority and power and influence in a particular situation. And a follower is simply someone with less authority, power, and influence in a particular situation. And that goes back and forth all the time. When I'm in my classroom, I'm a leader. When I go down to the provost's office, I'm a follower. And we trade on and off with that every day and not thinking about it. I don't think followership is a bad thing. I think it's something that happens, but we have been trained that that is a bad word. I think we need to rethink about the leadership as a process as opposed to a person. Yeah.
So as we finish up the session today, we have one more question. As you define the different styles of leadership, which are the most effective, and how do you recognize that the change has to be made? And then we will conclude the webinar afterwards.
So
We'll start with Dr. McManus. Yep.
This is a question that my students will often ask, or I'll ask my students, and they give me this question, this answer, and it drives me crazy, but they're right. And they'll often say it's situational, right? And my response is, so what's the situation? What's being called for here? Do we need more of a servant approach in order to help this particular person? Do we need to consider the goal in the organization? Do we need to give the work back to the people? All of these factors, that's why I really like Stan's metaphor of what we've given you today, and what we give in the book essentially is a tool belt to say what's needed here in this situation, what's the best ethical response and why, and what's the best leadership response and why.
And Dr. Ward, your response?
Yeah, I would really just echo what Rob was saying. I think a lot of it is, and that's why we use these framing questions, is to say, okay, where's the problem? Where's the challenge lie? Where do we need to put our energy? And once you're able to identify which of those components need the energy and need the work, then you can start thinking, okay, this is a situation where we need adaptive leadership because the context is so complex. There's no technical solution here, and we really need to pay attention to this. Or you can say, oh man, this is really about the character of the leader. We've got to bring we're going to have to bring a virtue ethic in here into play and work on this. So just think of it in terms of where is the challenge? Where do you seem to be stuck? And that stuckness can tell you which of these models to bring to bear.
Outstanding. So we want to thank you to both Dr. McManus and Dr. Ward for today's webinar. We thank you as the attendees for today. It was an awesome conversation. Our next webinar on ethical leadership is going to be on Tuesday, November 21st at 6 p.m. In the month of December, we have two webinars, December 13th and December 19th. We will hear from our speaker on the topic of a topic that relates to discussing leaders and how they can build on strategic visions and successful areas of organizational change. In the month of January, on January 4th and 9th, we will have a presentation on goal setting. And in February, we have February 15th and February 21st, we have discussion on supporting diverse populations on campus and in the workspace. So again, thank you to Dr. McManus and Dr. Ward for the presentation. If you have any other questions, please reach out to our office. Both Dr. McManus and Dr. Ward will be able to answer your questions via email at that time. And again, thank you for attending our event, and we hope to see you at future events coming forward. Have a wonderful and great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you, gang.
Bye.
Thank you.